With a sound like tearing oak, the great beam gave way, and May shoved the man aside, catching the impossible weight of the roof across her own broad back. If this story moves you, do me a kindness before we go any further. Subscribe to the channel, follow it all the way to the end, because the part that will stay with you comes late, and leave the name of your town down in the comments so we can all watch together how far this story travels. Now let me carry you back to where it truly began. She arrived on a Thursday, walking up the long alkali track that led to the Harding place. The dust coated the hem of her plain poplin dress and settled in the lines of her face, a face she had learned to keep still. She carried one small carpet bag, holding everything she owned in the world, and her shadow stretched long and wide behind her in the afternoon sun. She did not look like a savior. She looked like what she was, a woman with nowhere else to go. She had been told all her life that she was too much, too big for a woman, too plain for a bride, too foreign for a neighbor. Her bigness, her color, her too muchness had followed her from the city docks to the railroad camps, a litany of dismissals that had forged the armor she now wore. It was an armor of silence, of competence, of expecting nothing so that she would never be disappointed. She had learned to mend harnesses with the skill of a master saddler. She had learned to read a ledger and see the lies hiding between the columns of ink. She had learned to set a bone, tend a fever, and stitch a wound so fine the scar was a mere silver thread. She had learned to be useful because the world had no place for her to simply be. The armor was heavy. Some days she felt its weight in her bones, a weariness that had nothing to do with the miles she had walked. But it was all she had, and so she kept her face still, kept her eyes down, and kept walking. The Harding Ranch was dying. She could read it in the language of the land. The land talked, if you knew how to listen, and she had learned the language of it long ago. It spoke in the slumped shoulders of the fence posts, their wire guts sagging onto the thirsty ground. It spoke in the dry rattle of the creek bed, which should have been running with snowmelt from the high peaks. It spoke in the listless posture of the cattle, their hides loose over their ribs, their eyes dull with a thirst that went deeper than water. The main house sagged, its porch listing like a ship taking on water, and the great barn, the heart of the place, had a wound in its roof patched over with mismatched weathered planks. It was a place hollowed out by grief, and she knew that language too. It was the same language her own heart spoke in the quiet hours before dawn. A man came out onto the porch. He was tall and carried his own kind of weariness, a stoop in his shoulders that had more to do with burden than age. His face was drawn, his eyes holding a distant sorrow that she recognized instantly. This was John Harding, the grieving widower, the man who had lost his wife a year past and was now losing his land piece by painful piece. He watched her approach, his expression unreadable. He saw a large Chinese woman, dusty and plain, walking as if she had a right to be there. He saw a problem he did not have the energy for. She stopped a respectful distance from the porch steps, setting down her bag. She did not offer a name or a reason. She waited. Her stillness was a thing to be reckoned with. It was not passive, it was a wall. "What do you want?" he asked, his voice rough from disuse. She lifted her chin, just enough to look past him, toward the dry creek bed and the thirsty fields beyond. "Your upper sluice gate is jammed," she said. Her voice was calm, a statement of fact, not an accusation. "The one on the North Fork, it is blocked with silt and a fallen cottonwood. You are losing all your water down the old wash." He stared at her. No one had been up to the North Fork in months. He had not had the time, had not had the heart. He had let the old-timer, Jebediah, handle it, and Jebediah only had one good arm. He had assumed it was just the drought, a punishment from a silent God. The quiet stretched between them. The wind whispered through the dry grass, carrying the scent of dust and defeat. He looked at this strange, solid woman, at her still face that gave nothing away. She had not asked for work, had not asked for charity. She had given him a fact, a diagnosis of his slow ruin. "Say that again," he said, the words barely a whisper. "The gate is jammed," she repeated, her voice even. "Your water is bleeding into the alkali flats. Your land is dying of thirst because its veins are blocked." He looked from her unmoving face to the parched land that was his legacy and his prison. He was a man drowning, And this woman had just pointed out that his boat had a hole in it. It was more than anyone else had done for him in a year. Desperation was a hard master, but it made a man see clearly. He saw not her race, not her size, but the undeniable truth in her eyes. "Can you fix it?" he asked. "Yes," she said. He nodded slowly, a long, weary motion. "There is a room in the back, food on the table. Start tomorrow." He turned and went back inside without another word, the screen door sighing shut behind him. May stood for a moment longer, the sun on her back. She had a room. She had work. For now it was enough. She picked up her bag and walked toward the house, her shadow falling over the broken land. The next morning, before the sun had crested the eastern ridge, she was gone. John Harding found the back room empty, the bed made with a neatness that shamed the rest of the house. He felt a familiar pang of disappointment, the bitter taste of a hope so small he had not even realized he was holding it. He assumed she had left, another drifter scared off by the sheer scale of the decay. But when he went out to the barn, he found Jebediah, the one-armed old-timer, staring dumbfounded at the forge. It was roaring with a clean, hot flame. May stood before it, her sleeves rolled up her powerful forearms, hammering a length of iron into a long, sharp-toothed rake. She moved with an economy of motion, a deep and practiced competence that was almost beautiful to watch. The hammer rose and fell, and the iron bent to her will. "She asked for the forge," Jebediah grunted, not taking his eyes off her. "Said she needed a proper drag hook. Never seen a woman handle a hammer like that." There was a grudging respect in his voice, the first crack in his cynical shell. She worked all day. She did not stop for water or food. She fashioned the tool she needed, a brutal, heavy thing of iron and wood. Then she took one of the draft horses, a weary beast named Goliath, and led him up the winding path to the North Fork. John watched her go, a solid, unhurried figure moving with absolute purpose. He saw her again at dusk. She was covered in mud and sweat, her dress stained and torn, but she walked with the same steady pace. Behind her, a sound he had not heard in a year echoed down the small canyon. The gurgle and rush of water. It was a song of life returning. The main irrigation ditch, which had been a dusty scar for months, was now a ribbon of dark, wet earth, with a trickle of water finding its old path. He met her by the barn. He had no words. He just looked at the life-giving water, then back at her exhausted, mud-streaked face. For the first time, the stillness of her expression seemed less like armor and more like a deep, settled calm. "The main branch of the cottonwood is cleared," she said, her voice low and tired. "The rest will wash out by morning. The gate is open." He simply nodded. Gratitude was a foreign country he had not visited in a long time, and he did not know the language. But he knew with a certainty that settled deep in his gut that he had been saved from one small part of his ruin. And it was this woman who had done it. Her next project was the child, a small, silent girl named Sarah, who moved through the house like a ghost. She was a shadow of her father's grief, her eyes too old for her 7 years. She had not spoken more than a handful of words since her mother had passed, and she flinched from any touch. May did not try to coax her, did not try to bribe her with sweets or coo at her with false cheer. She simply existed in the same space as the child. She would sit at the kitchen table, mending harnesses or patching clothes, and she would talk. She did not talk to Sarah, but to the objects in her hands. "Now, Needle," she would murmur, her voice a low hum, "you must go straight and true. This denim is stubborn, like an old mule." Or, "Ah, Leather, you have been dry too long. A little oil, a little care, and you will be strong again." She left small things for the girl to find. A perfectly carved bird made from a scrap of pine, a string of polished river stones, a single perfect wildflower tucked into the girl's water cup at the table. She never watched to see if Sarah took them. She simply left the offerings and went about her work. One afternoon, Sarah was watching from the porch steps as May split firewood. May was using a heavy maul, bringing it down with a force that made the rounds of pine and cedar explode. It was work for a strong man, yet she did it with a steady, tireless rhythm. A large splinter flew from a splitting log and landed near the girl's bare feet. Without thinking, Sarah reached down and picked it up. It was fragrant with the smell of cedar. She held it in her small hand, watching May work. May finished the log, stacked the pieces neatly, and then turned. Her eyes met Sarah's. The girl did not flinch. She did not run. She simply stood there, holding the piece of wood. May gave a slow, small nod. It was not a smile, but it was a recognition, an acknowledgement. Sarah clutched the splinter in her hand and, for the first time in a year, she went back into the house, not as a ghost, but as a little girl holding a treasure. The wall of silence had its first crack. Jebediah was a harder case. He had lost his arm in a mill accident 20 years ago and had lost his faith in just about everything shortly after. He watched May with a sour, suspicious eye. He saw her strength, her skill, but he saw it through a lens of prejudice. He muttered to the other ranch hands, what few were left, about the strange Chinese woman and the spell she seemed to be casting over the boss. The moment of his conversion came during a late summer storm. A fierce wind tore through the valley, whipping the rain into horizontal sheets. A section of the already weakened barn roof, the part with the shoddy patch, began to peel away. The horses in the stalls below panicked, their whinnies sharp with terror. John and Jebediah were struggling to secure a heavy canvas over the hole, but the wind was a living thing, ripping it from their grasp. A heavy support joist, rotted through at its base, groaned and began to splinter. It was about to give way, bringing tons of hay and timber down on them and the horses. "Get out!" John yelled at Jebediah. "It's coming down!" But Jebediah was frozen, his one good hand still clinging to a rope, his face pale in the gloom. Just then May appeared. She had been securing the chicken coop. She took in the scene in a single glance. The splintering joist, the terrified horses, the two men about to be crushed. She did not shout. She did not hesitate. She grabbed a thick length of discarded timber, a post from an old corral, and jammed it under the failing joist. Then, with a grunt that seemed to come from the very center of the earth, she put her shoulder to the timber and heaved. Muscles bunched in her back and arms. The timber creaked. The joist groaned in protest. For a heart-stopping moment, nothing happened. Then slowly, impossibly, the failing beam was lifted. Just an inch, then two, taking the immense strain off the rotted base. "Jebediah," she said, her voice tight with effort. "The rope. Brace it on the main pillar. Now!" Her voice, calm and absolute in the chaos, broke his paralysis. He scrambled to do as he was told, wrapping the rope, pulling it taut. John rushed to help him. They secured the brace just as May's strength began to fail. The temporary post held. The immediate danger was past. They stood there in the screaming wind, breathing heavily, soaked to the bone. Jebediah looked at the timber post holding up the roof. He looked at May, who was leaning against a stall door, her face as still as ever, though her chest rose and fell with deep, ragged breaths. He looked at his own single hand, then back at her. "Damn," he breathed, the word full of awe. "God damn." He walked over to her, his usual sour expression gone, replaced by something else entirely. I've never seen a thing like that." May simply nodded, accepting the words as her due. From that day on, Jebediah was her shadow. Her word was law. If May said a fence needed mending, he mended it. If May said a horse was sick, he trusted her diagnosis over the town veterinarians. He had seen her strength, and it had remade his world. The ranch began to breathe again. Water flowed, fences were mended. The livestock grew stronger. A sense of order, of quiet competence, began to push back the tide of decay. But a sickness of a different kind was festering, just beyond their borders. His name was Silas Croft. He was the town banker, a man whose body was as soft as his words, whose smile was set on his face like it had been put there with a trowel. He arrived one Tuesday in a fine buggy, the leather gleaming, the horse a fat, glossy black. He was everything the Harding Ranch was not: prosperous, clean, and confident. He greeted John Harding with a warm handshake and a sorrowful look. "John, my friend," he said, his voice dripping with false sympathy, "I came to see how you were faring. The town worries." John, who was still bound by the memory of Croft's kindness when his wife had been ill, the banker had waived a loan payment, a gesture of Christian charity John had never forgotten, greeted him with a weary gratitude. He was blind to the predator standing on his porch. May was coming from the smokehouse carrying a side of cured bacon. She saw the buggy, the soft man, the trowel smile, and her armor clicked invisibly into place. She knew this type of man. The world was full of them. Men who used soft words to hide hard hearts. Croft's eyes slid over to her. He took in her size, her plain dress, her foreign face. His smile did not falter, but his eyes held a flicker of amusement and contempt. He looked her up and down as if she were a piece of livestock. "Well now, John," Croft said, his voice booming with false heartiness, "I see you found yourself some substantial help. A sturdy specimen indeed." The words hung in the air, heavy and insulting. Substantial, sturdy, specimen. Words for a draft horse, not a person. John Harding, lost in his own world of obligation and grief, did not even notice the slight. But May noticed. She felt the sting of it, a familiar wound. She kept her face still, her eyes fixed on some distant point, and walked past them into the house, the insult settling like a stone in her gut. She was used to it, but it never stopped hurting. It was just one more layer on the armor. That night she could not sleep. The words echoed in her mind. Substantial, sturdy. She thought of the man's soft hands, hands that had never known a callus. She thought of his smile, a mask for the rot beneath, and a cold suspicion began to form in her mind. Men like that did not perform acts of charity without expecting a return on their investment. There was another skill she possessed, one no one on the ranch knew about. Before she had been a mender of harnesses and a splitter of wood, she had been her father's bookkeeper in his small, failed shop. He had taught her numbers. He had taught her that ink and paper told truer stories than any man's words. She lit a lamp and went to the small office where John kept his papers. The desk was a disaster of unpaid bills, old letters, and dusty ledgers bound in cracked leather. With John's quiet, trusting permission given weeks ago to put things in order, she began to work. She opened the first ledger. Her fingers, strong and calloused from manual labor, moved with a surprising delicacy over the brittle pages. She began to read the story of the Harding Ranch, a story written in columns of profit and, increasingly, loss. She read the story of John's wife's illness, the mounting doctor's bills, the loans taken against the land, and then she found it, a discrepancy, a small one at first, almost unnoticeable, an interest payment calculated at a slightly higher rate than the contract stipulated, a fee for services never rendered. She cross-referenced it with another ledger, then another. The night wore on. The lamp burned low. By dawn, she had the whole story spread out on the desk. It was a spider's web of deceit, spun with beautiful calligraphy and legal terms. Silas Croft had not been kind. He had been patient. The waived loan payment had been a hook, baited with sympathy. Every subsequent loan, every extension, every note carried with it clauses and fees buried in the fine print. He was not just charging interest. He was systematically bleeding the ranch dry, siphoning its value, positioning himself to seize the land and its precious water rights for pennies on the dollar when the final foreclosure came. The foreclosure was scheduled for the end of the month. Croft's visit had not been one of concern. It had been a final inspection of his prize before the kill. She sat back, the papers before her a testament to a quiet, smiling evil. The man had used John's grief as a tool, his trust as a weapon. A cold, righteous anger burned in her chest, a fire that warmed her for the first time in years. The armor was still there, but now it felt less like a defense and more like a weapon waiting to be used. She waited until John had finished his morning coffee, the bitter brew that was his only real companion. She laid the main ledger on the kitchen table, open to the most damning page. She placed the loan agreement beside it, her finger pointing to a specific clause. "Mr. Harding," she began, her voice low and steady, "you need to look at this." He looked, but he did not see. He saw numbers, legal words he did not understand. "What is it, May?" "It is theft," she said simply. "Mr. Croft has been stealing from you for over a year. He is not your friend. He is the reason you are failing." She explained it to him, step by step. She showed him the inflated interest, the phantom fees, the clause that gave the bank ownership of the water rights in case of default. She laid the truth bare on the worn wood of the kitchen table. John Harding shook his head, a deep, stubborn denial taking hold. "No, you're wrong. Silas, he helped us. When Martha was sick, he told me not to worry about the payment. He said, "We're neighbors, John. We look after our own." "He used your wife's death to blind you," May said, her voice devoid of pity, full only of hard truth. "He gave you a single meal, and in return, he is taking your whole farm." He looked from the papers to her still face. He was a man caught between a comforting lie and a devastating truth. He wanted to rage at her, to call her a liar, to throw her out. But he looked into her eyes and he saw no malice, no ambition. He saw only the calm, unwavering certainty of someone who had read the facts and understood them completely. He saw the same competence that had opened his sluice gate and braced his barn roof. He slumped into his chair, the fight going out of him. The weight of the truth was heavier than any grief he had carried. He had been a fool, a blind, grieving fool. "All right, May," he said, and the sound of her name spoken with such weary finality was a surrender and a coronation all at once. It was the moment their alliance was truly forged, not as master and servant, but as two people standing against a common ruin. "All right, what do we do?" Winter came early that year, a sudden, violent blizzard that buried the valley in a deep shroud of white. The wind howled for 3 days, piling drifts against the house and barn. It was a time of enforced stillness, of huddling close to the fire. But the storm was also a trial. On the second night, the weight of the snow on the weakened barn roof became too much. With a great groan of tortured wood, the section they had braced months earlier finally gave way. The collapse was sudden and catastrophic. It happened as John was leading the last of the horses into the relative safety of the main stable. A massive beam, coated in snow and ice, crashed down, pinning him by the leg. He cried out, a sharp sound swallowed by the wind. May and Jebediah heard it from the house. They fought their way through the blinding snow, the lantern casting a frantic, dancing light. They found him trapped, the beam pressing him into the frozen ground, his face pale with shock and pain. Sarah, who had followed them, stood at the edge of the light, a small, terrified statue. "The leg's broken," John gritted out, his voice strained. "You have to get this off me." Jebediah, with his one arm, was useless for lifting. He could only stand there, his face a mask of helpless fury. But May did not hesitate. She handed the lantern to Jebediah. She planted her feet wide in the snow, found a handhold on the splintered underside of the beam, and lifted. It was a dead, impossible weight. For a moment, it did not move. She grunted, a raw sound of pure effort torn from her throat. She drew on every bit of strength she had, the strength born of a life of labor, the strength the world called too much. The beam lifted. It rose an inch, then 6, then a foot. It was just enough. "Pull him out," she gasped, her arms trembling, her muscles screaming. Jebediah lunged forward, grabbing John under the arms and dragging him clear. The moment he was free, May let the beam crash back to the ground. She fell to her knees in the snow, breathing in huge, shuddering gasps. The world spun in a white vortex around her. Later, after they had gotten John inside, after she had set his leg with practiced hands and bound it with clean splints, he reached for her. She was sitting by the fire, her body aching, her face in its usual mask of stillness. He took her hand. His was rough and calloused, but his touch was surprisingly gentle. "You saved my life," he said, his voice quiet with awe and a dawning, profound understanding. He looked at her, truly looked at her, not as his help, not as a strange outcast, but as the woman who had held up his roof and now held his entire world together. He held her hand for a long moment, a silent acknowledgement that passed between them, more powerful than any words. It was the first time anyone had touched her with simple, unadorned gratitude. A small, unfamiliar warmth spread through her chest, and for a moment, the old armor felt less like a prison and more like a shell that was beginning to crack. Silas Croft learned of John Harding's broken leg and May's growing influence through town gossip, a force more potent than any newspaper. He realized she was not just a sturdy field hand. She was a threat. He could not attack her with ledgers and laws, so he chose a different weapon: whispers. The rumors started small, like sparks in dry grass. They spread from the general store to the church steps, from the saloon to the sewing circles. That Chinese woman at the Harding place. Unseemly, a lone woman living with a widower. What kind of influence could she be on that poor, motherless child? They said she was a heathen, that she practiced strange arts. Her very competence was twisted into something sinister. Her strength became unnatural, her intelligence a sign of cunning and deceit. The story grew with each telling, fanned by fear and prejudice, until it was a wildfire of public opinion. The fire reached Eleanor Vance. Mrs. Vance was the wife of the town reverend, a leader among the respectable women, a woman whose own life had been marked by a deep, unhealed wound. She had lost her only son to a fever years ago, and her grief had calcified into a rigid, fierce morality. She saw the world in stark terms of right and wrong, decency and depravity. The rumors about May offended her righteous soul. She saw it as her Christian duty to intervene, to save that poor Harding girl from the influence of a foreign usurper. She arrived at the ranch one afternoon, her back straight, her face set in a mask of grim purpose. She found May in the vegetable garden, weeding the new spring greens. "You," Mrs. Vance said, her voice sharp, dispensing with any pleasantries. "I am here to speak with you about the child." May rose slowly, brushing the dark earth from her hands. She recognized the woman from town. She saw the pain behind the righteousness in her eyes, a pain so deep it had become a weapon. She did not raise her voice. She did not defend herself. She waited. "The women of this town are concerned," Mrs. Vance continued, her voice gaining strength. "It is not proper what is happening here. A woman of your kind having such sway over a good Christian family. That child needs a mother's guidance, not the company of a field hand." The insult was meant to sting, but May had endured far worse. Instead of anger, she felt a wave of empathy. She looked at Mrs. Vance, at the tightly clenched fists, the brittle posture, and she saw the ghost of a lost child. "Your son," May said, her voice soft. "He had blue eyes, did he not? And he was fond of whittling small animals from scraps of wood." Eleanor Vance froze. The blood drained from her face. No one had spoken of her son in years. It was a grief too sacred to be touched. How did you know that?" she stammered. "Jebediah told me," May answered gently. "He said your boy, Thomas, used to follow him around the smithy. He said the boy was clever with his hands. He said his laugh was like the sound of a spring thaw." May took a step closer. She did not reach out, did not offer a comforting touch. She offered something far more rare, the truth of a shared sorrow. "To lose a child," May said, her voice barely a whisper, "is to have a piece of your own heart buried in the cold ground. The world keeps turning, the seasons change, but there is a place inside you that is forever winter." Tears welled in Eleanor Vance's eyes, tears she had not shed in a decade. The rigid mask of morality crumbled, revealing the grieving mother beneath. She saw that this woman, this outcast, understood her pain in a way no one else in her polite Christian town ever had. She saw not a threat, but a fellow survivor. She turned without another word and walked away, her shoulders slumped. She left the ranch shaken, her certainties shattered, her world remade. She had come to cast a stone, and had instead been shown her own reflection in a pool of quiet water. The day of the foreclosure arrived. Silas Croft, confident in his victory, had orchestrated the final act to be a public humiliation. He stood on the steps of his own bank. A crowd of townspeople gathered before him. He had called in all of Harding's notes. It was over. He began to speak, his voice full of that familiar, oily sympathy. "My friends, it is with a heavy heart," he began, "that we gather today. I have done all I can for our friend, John Harding. But some misfortunes, alas, cannot be outrun. It pains me to execute this final duty." John stood beside him, leaning on a crutch, his face grim and defeated. He was playing his part, just as May had instructed. Then a path opened in the crowd. May walked through it. She was not dressed in her usual work clothes, but in a clean, dark bombazine dress she had saved for funerals. In her hands she carried the ranch's ledgers. She walked up the steps and stood beside John Harding, facing Silas Croft. A murmur went through the crowd. Croft's smile tightened. "This is a private business matter, madam," he said, his voice hard. "Theft is everyone's business, Mr. Croft," May said, her voice clear and calm, carrying over the silent crowd. She opened the first ledger. "On May the 10th, 2 years ago, you loaned John Harding $500. The contract stipulated an interest rate of 6%. She turned a page. Yet your ledger shows you charged him 7%. A small theft. The theft of a desperate man's hope." She went on, page by page, entry by entry. She did not raise her voice. She did not use angry words. She simply read the facts. She laid out the entire fraudulent scheme with the cold, irrefutable precision of a surgeon. She exposed the hidden fees, the illegal compound interest, the fraudulent service charges. The crowd listened, their expressions changing from curiosity to suspicion, and then to a slow, simmering anger. Croft's face, for the first time, lost its smile. It sagged, revealing the soft, cruel features beneath. "These are lies," he sputtered. "Fabrications from a scheming, yellow—" He caught himself, but it was too late. The ugliness was out. "He is the liar!" A voice rang out from the crowd. It was Eleanor Vance. She pushed her way to the front, her face blazing with a convert's fire. "This woman speaks the truth. I have seen her heart, and it is truer than any man's here. Silas Croft, you hide behind a prayer book on Sunday, but your soul is a rotten pit." That broke the dam. Jebediah stepped forward, his one good hand clenched into a fist. "She's right. That man's a viper." Others joined in, their voices rising in a chorus of outrage. They were the people Croft had cheated and squeezed for years, and now seeing his weakness, they turned on him. His power, built on a foundation of lies and intimidation, crumbled in an instant. The smiling predator was exposed, and the herd was no longer afraid. He was ruined. A year passed, then another. The seasons turned, and the Harding Ranch was transformed. It was no longer a place of grief and decay. It was a showplace, a hidden gem in the valley. The creek ran full and clear. The fields were lush with alfalfa. The cattle were fat and healthy. The house stood straight and proud, with a new porch and a coat of white paint, and the barn had a fine new roof that did not leak. It was a place of life, of quiet prosperity, built on a foundation of competence and care. May was the undisputed heart of it all. She was no longer just the help, she was the foundation. Sarah, who now chattered like a magpie, was rarely far from her side, her small hand often tucked into May's large one. Jebediah took his orders from her without question, his loyalty absolute. Eleanor Vance was her closest friend, the two women bound by a shared understanding that transcended words. They had created a family, not of blood, but of choice. A found family patched together from broken pieces, stronger than any born of simple obligation. One evening, in the long gold light of late summer, John found her on the new porch. She was watching the sun set behind the mountains, her face for once not still, but soft with a quiet contentment. He had lost his crutch and his limp, and the stoop in his shoulders was gone. The grief had not disappeared, but it no longer defined him. He stood beside her, and for a long time, they just watched the sky turn from gold to purple. "I remember the first day you came," he said finally, his voice low. "I saw a dusty, tired woman, and I thought you were just one more problem I didn't have the strength to solve. I expected so little of you." He turned to face her, his eyes full of a deep, abiding reverence. "You fixed my water. You healed my child. You saved my life. You faced down a thief and gave me back my pride. Everything I almost lost, everything I have now, it is because of you." He reached out and gently touched her arm. "The world told you that you were too much, too big, too strong, too plain. Silas Croft called you substantial as an insult, but he was right. You are substantial. Your bigness held up my roof. Your strength fought a blizzard. Your stubborn too-muchness saved this family. Everything they mocked you for is everything that saved us." The words washed over her, a gentle tide eroding the shores of a lifetime of hurt. The old armor, the heavy shield she had carried for so long, began to feel loose, its plates shifting and falling away. All the dismissals, all the insults, all the loneliness. It was all being undone by this one man's quiet, honest words in the golden light. "I don't want to be your boss anymore, May," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "And I don't want you to be my servant. I want you to be my partner, your name next to mine on the deed, an equal share in everything we build here. I'm not asking you to stay because I need you. I'm asking you to stay because you belong here. Because because I love you." She felt the last piece of the armor fall away with a clang that only she could hear. It lay shattered at her feet, and for the first time, she stood unprotected in the world, and she was not afraid. A lifetime of pain, of being too much, of being not enough, washed out of her, leaving behind only a profound, quiet peace. She let out a breath she had been holding for 30 years. She turned her face fully to his. "Yes,